He was supposed to be the last person you'd expect on a battlefield. A star athlete, a household name, a man with fame, fortune, and a future brighter than most could ever dream. Pat Tillman wasn't just any football player. He was one of the NFL's rising icons, known not just for his ferocious play, but for the wild, untamed spirit that made him unforgettable. In stadiums packed with thousands, under lights that glittered like false suns, he had it all. Money, celebrity, the kind of immortality that sports promises to its chosen few. But when the towers fell on September 11th, 2001, everything changed. America was on fire, and so was he. Where others talked about sacrifice, Tillman acted. He turned down a multi-million-dollar contract. He walked away from the adoration, from the jersey with his name, from the easy life he'd earned. And he enlisted. Not as a symbolic gesture, not for the cameras, but for real. As a soldier, an Army Ranger, on the ground, in uniform, carrying a rifle into the unknown. It was a decision that stunned the world. To many, he became something larger than life. The golden boy who traded glory for duty. A living embodiment of patriotism when America needed it most. He was not just a soldier. He was a symbol. And that symbol was powerful. The press covered his every move. The government pointed to his story. And people believed in him as proof that sacrifice was still alive in America. But symbols are fragile. They can be twisted, and sometimes they can be destroyed. Before he was a headline, Pat was just Pat. Friends described him as fiercely independent, stubborn to a fault, and allergic to conformity. He was the kind of man who read philosophy on flights to away games, who questioned authority even when it was unpopular, who sought truth no matter where it led. On the field, he was a warrior. Off it, he was a thinker. This duality followed him into the military. He trained hard, fought hard, and pushed himself beyond limits. But he also wrote letters home filled with doubt, reflection, and a kind of searching honesty rare among soldiers. He wasn't naive. He didn't believe in blind loyalty. He believed in service, in sacrifice, in doing what he thought was right, even if it cost him everything. In many ways, that's what made him dangerous. Because men like Pat Tillman don't just fight wars, they see them for what they really are. And that's why, when he finally went to Afghanistan, his story was destined to be more than just another soldier's tale. It would become a story about truth, and the lengths powerful institutions will go to bury it. On April 22, 2004, deep in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, Pat Tillman's journey came to its end. The Army's story was simple, almost poetic. He died heroically in a firefight with Taliban insurgents. Ambushed in a canyon, fighting to his last breath, he fell as a warrior, a model of courage, a symbol of sacrifice. Within hours, the narrative spread across America. Headlines blared, "NFL star killed in combat." Newspapers called him a patriot who gave his life in defense of freedom. The White House spoke his name as proof of American resolve. The nation mourned, and at the same time, rallied. At his funeral, flags rippled in the desert wind. Generals and dignitaries offered solemn words. His story was elevated to myth, the football hero who gave it all, dying as bravely as he had lived. It was the perfect tale of valor in a war that desperately needed heroes. But beneath the grandeur, whispers began. Something about the story didn't fit. The first cracks came not from journalists, but from the battlefield itself. Men who had fought alongside Tillman returned with questions. Details in their accounts clashed with the official reports.
The distance of the gunfire, the angle of the wounds, the timing of the ambush, nothing lined up. Then there were the documents, medical reports that seemed inconsistent, ballistic evidence that raised more questions than answers. Each piece on its own was small, but together they pointed to something larger, something darker. Back home, Tillman's family noticed the silence. They were given no clear answers, only rehearsed statements. The army spoke in abstractions, in vague platitudes. They celebrated his sacrifice, but avoided the details of his death. Conversations with his brothers-in-arms grew uneasy. Some refused to talk. Others hinted but held back as if bound by something unspoken. It was as if a curtain had been pulled down over the truth, and no one dared to lift it. And slowly, a dreadful suspicion emerged. Maybe Pat Tillman hadn't been killed by the enemy at all. Maybe the bullet that ended his life had come from his own side.
It would take weeks before the army admitted the truth. Pat Tillman had not been killed by Taliban fighters. He had been killed by friendly fire. 3 bullets fired at close range, not from the enemy's position, but from his own brothers in arms. At first, this revelation was delivered quietly, almost reluctantly, as though it were an afterthought. The army insisted it was a tragic accident, a split second of confusion in the chaos of war. And maybe in another story, that explanation would have been enough. But here, the lies ran deeper. Because while the army already knew the truth within days of his death, the official story of heroism had been allowed, even encouraged to spread. They had buried him with speeches of valor, knowing those speeches were built on a falsehood. They had let a grieving family stand in the spotlight of a national funeral, repeating words that leaders knew were not true. And they had allowed a nation to cling to a myth while concealing the reality. For the Tillman family, this was not just tragedy, it was betrayal. Pat's mother, Mary, refused to accept the silence. She pressed for details. She demanded documents, and what she uncovered was worse than she imagined. Reports had been rewritten, witness statements altered, evidence destroyed, key files simply vanished. What should have been a straightforward, if tragic, investigation had been turned into a labyrinth of omissions and half-truths. Even Pat's personal diary, the intimate record of his thoughts, had disappeared, burned, according to one soldier, on orders from above. His brother, Kevin, who had been deployed with him in Afghanistan, returned home furious. He testified before Congress, calling the government's handling of Pat's death a deliberate act of deception. The family stopped speaking in hushed tones. They went public. And once the story broke into the open, it revealed something larger than one man's death. It revealed the machinery of a system desperate to control its own narrative. By the time investigations reached Capitol Hill, it was clear. Pat Tillman's death had been used. His sacrifice had been turned into propaganda. His story weaponized to sustain a war. The military called it miscommunication, but to the Tillman family, it was a cover-up, one that dishonored not just Pat, but the very ideals he had died believing in. And so, the question grew louder. Who killed Pat Tillman? And perhaps more importantly, who buried the truth of how he died?
Years have passed since that canyon in Afghanistan. The official inquiries ended long ago. Generals have retired. Politicians have moved on. The war itself has faded into history's blur of headlines and casualties. But for the Tillman family, the wound never healed. Not because Pat died. They accepted his choice to serve, his willingness to sacrifice. What they could not accept was the lie, the way his death was rewritten, reshaped into a story that served power rather than truth. For them, the betrayal was not the bullet, it was the silence that followed. Today, Pat Tillman is remembered in fragments. To some, he is still the athlete who gave it all for his country. To others, he is the soldier betrayed by the very institution he trusted. His story has become a paradox, both a symbol of courage and a reminder of corruption. At West Point, cadets still study his letters. Philosophers cite him as an example of moral conviction. And in quiet corners of America, veterans whisper his name with a mix of reverence and rage. Because what happened to Pat Tillman is not just the story of one man, it is the story of what happens when truth itself becomes a casualty of war. Maybe that is his real legacy, that his life and his death force us to ask uncomfortable questions. What is loyalty worth if it demands silence in the face of injustice? What is patriotism if it requires the burial of truth? And how should we honor sacrifice, with myth or with honesty? Pat Tillman never got to answer those questions, but perhaps we can. Perhaps we must. Because in the end, history is not just written by the victors, it is written by those brave enough to tell the truth.